Hi, Pia. Hi, Cecilia.
Hello.
Thanks for taking some time out of your busy schedule to join me on this video conversation about a report that you've both authored called Cashing In on the Pandemic, which is a report for the Transnational Institute and CEO Corporate Europe Observatory. We are still in the middle of one of the worst pandemic in recent history, right? The number of people contaminated is going up every day. So far, nearly 900,000 people have died from the virus. 27 million people, at least, have been affected. Unemployment rates around the world are going through the roof. The health of people is terrible. A lot of people are into depression. Lots of people have lost their job. And the bottom line is a lot of people are really struggling to survive right now. What most people know is that right in the middle of this major crisis, in secrecy, pretty much, lawyers are actually plotting to sue governments over COVID-19 response measures. So you are both the authors of the report I've just mentioned. And my first question might be very simple, but how can this be allowed to happen? And maybe Pia, you want to start.
Well, yeah, I understand the astonishment, because I guess for us it was the same. You are worried about the pandemic, and you think the focus should really be to protect lives, people's livelihoods, and the economy. And then we stumbled across these really many papers by global law firms that go into a very different direction, because they are not thinking about the lives of people, but about how to make a lot of money from the crisis, and indeed encourage governments, companies to sue governments over the measures that they took. And it's possible because of a number of international agreements, more than thousands of international trade and investment agreements that governments signed, many of them many years ago, when no one had any idea about the pandemic. And these agreements indeed give corporations a lot of rights to sue governments, and lawyers and international law firms have really made this field a big business for them in the last years. And obviously they're now also jumping on the crisis, seizing this opportunity to make a lot of money.
Cecilia, maybe can you give us an example of a specific case and explain maybe what type of lawsuits could be launched and attacking governments for which specific measures?
Yeah, sure. So there's been, as Pia said, all these law firms giving warnings, but in actual fact, the first country to receive an actual threat of an arbitration claim due to measures related to COVID-19 was Peru. In April, the Congress of Peru approved a law that suspended the collection of tolls in the country during the crisis. And of course, the purpose of this measure was to facilitate transport of essential goods and workers, a moment also of many people that had lost their jobs and could not pay for the cost of the tolls. And immediately, 6 foreign companies threatened to sue as a result of this law. So this hasn't yet materialized in an actual lawsuit, but the threat is there, and the law has been contested and is now in the process of being reviewed and so on. So we don't have yet an exact or a concrete case, but the threats are already starting to emerge. And the measures that investors can challenge are endless. International law firms that Pia was mentioning have highlighted several examples. For example, governments that suspended disconnections of water, gas, and electricity services if households could not pay their bills during the crisis. That could lead to lawsuits. Governments that suspended evictions because people could not pay their mortgages. that could also lead to lawsuits. Governments, for example, that use private hospitals to treat corona patients when the public ones were too full, they were exploding. We heard these stories in the papers. That could also lead to lawsuits. Governments that issue what it's called compulsory licenses. This is to avoid big pharmaceutical companies profiteering from drugs, from tests, from vaccines for the dealing with the pandemic. Again, these companies could sue. We have the case of Argentina, in the middle of a restructuring of their sovereign debt, a measure that was supported even by the IMF. And yet we have investors that were in this negotiation threatening, again, to sue using these type of treaties. So it's endless, the type of measures that could lead anything that governments put in place to deal with the crisis that affects the business environment, that could lead to a loss of profit of these companies, could be liable for a lawsuit. So we cannot foresee exactly where the next one will come, but it's fairly certain that it will.
And these lawsuits happen in a very specific system, right? Like a special court, a special tribunal. We throughout the report, you've got this, ISDS mentioned very often. So maybe could you explain, Pia, what is ISDS and actually how did it come about?
Well, ISDS stands for Investor State Dispute Settlement. And as I said earlier, it is included in thousands of international agreements, trade and investment agreements, which governments have signed between each other. And by signing onto an ISDS deal, a government basically says, if a foreign investor comes to my country to invest, I don't know, in infrastructure, in whatever, and then is unhappy with something that the government does, so the executive, or something that a court rules or the parliament does, this gives the investor the right to sue the country outside of its own courts, or outside of European courts, for example, in Europe, and take this dispute to three private lawyers. They are called the arbitrators, and they will then decide if the state did something that is considered wrong on the basis of this agreement, and if the state has to pay compensation. And we know of more than 1,000 such lawsuits that have been filed around the world. The actual number is likely to be much, much higher because some of the cases remain secret, but we know of over 1,000 cases. And if you look at them, you see a bit what Cecilia just described, a whole variety of decisions that have been challenged. A decision by a government to ban a chemical because it was found to be toxic, or a decision to put in place, environmental regulations on a coal-fired power plant to lessen the damage that it will do on the environment where it's placed. Or governments have been sued because they reversed a privatization because it had turned out to be really bad and prices went up. So you could say this tool over the past 2 decades really has become like a weapon for companies which they can fight against basically everything they dislike that is being done, whether it's by parliaments or governments.
I mean, the question I have is that how, and maybe Cecilia, you can answer, how can this be legal in a way? How can a government agree to sign on to such an agreement where there is this special clause? I mean, it seems like historically, I don't know if you know the process, how was that a push from some kind of a lobby of, investors? But I'm having really trouble understand why a government would agree to sign an agreement with such the ISDS on it.
Yeah, so as Pia was saying, it's legal because governments agreed to resign sovereignty, and governments are the ones who agreed to allow investors to sue them using this type of treaties. Now, that makes it legal. That doesn't mean that the lawsuits that come out as a result of these treaties are, in my view, legitimate or moral. And you were asking how could governments agree to sign these type of treaties, and most of them were signed in the 90s when there was not full awareness of the risks. And at the time, there was also a widespread consensus that these type of treaties were needed to help attract foreign investment. So the argument went, you have to sign these treaties to attract foreign investment because you need to attract foreign investment in order to develop. So this was a simple type of logic. Now, today, we know that this is not the case. First of all, because there is no evidence of this correlation between signing agreements, these type of treaties, and the attraction of foreign direct investment. So what we have is that governments are left just with the risk and the cost, and the costs are very, very high. We're talking about millions and billions of US dollars that these lawsuits cost governments. So this is also what's motivating, in a way, governments to start terminating these type of treaties and to reassess what are the benefits versus the risks. It's a little bit more difficult to understand why they keep signing them today. I think there is, that's where we get into the territory of ideology and also corporate capture, and the whose interests are governments defending when they sign these type of treaties or when they negotiate them.
So in a way, if I want to play the devil's advocate, I would say that corporations are not to blame, right? They've put this into the agreement, and it's I guess inside governments that are to blame for signing these agreements in the first place. What do you think, Pia?
Well, I would say it's a shared responsibility for the mess we're in, of course. What governments did is they created a parallel justice system for corporations. They created it, and some continue to expand this by signing on to new agreements. And in many cases, parliaments ratified these agreements. I guess often not with a lot of debate and often not with knowing what they were doing. But they did it. So obviously there is a responsibility in the political arena. And as Cecilia said, the change has to come from there. They have the power to roll it back. But on the other hand, there is also a huge responsibility in the private sector, and particularly, I would say, amongst big corporations and amongst the law firms, because it's the lawyers that advertise this regime. As we see now in the current pandemic, they go and write briefings and do webinars for their corporate clients, telling them, look, this is how you can win a lot of money in these difficult times. So they really popularize the regime. When they sit as arbitrators deciding the cases, they have come up with crazy interpretations of the law, which has also, helped grow the regime. They lobby against any changes and reform. So I would say, there is also a responsibility in the private sector who has made the system what it has become today, as I said before, like a kind of corporate super weapon for everything that companies dislike. But you're right. Responsibility is also amongst governments, and this is where we have to push for change.
Because you've just mentioned it, Pia, but what we're really talking about is a parallel legal system for the super rich and the super wealthy, right? Because you've mentioned, Cecilia, that they could sue governments that have taken measures to actually help and save people, right? And they could, so in a way, we're talking about the rich and the super wealthy boycotting humanity, right? That's the type of world we're living in. What do you think, Cecilia, about that's such a legal system we're talking about? Because not a lot of people know about it either, right? It's very secret. It's not really advertised anywhere.
Well, I mean, this is clearly a system that it is geared towards protecting big corporations and the most wealthy individuals. If you just look at what is the cost of, a lawsuit, so we're not talking about the money in case that there is a positive, decision in favor of the investor, but just what cost to initiate these type of cases, to pay for the lawyers, to, deal with the case, the arbitrators that have to decide it, and all the cost around it. For an investor, the average should be around $6 million US. This is calculation that big institutions have made. So, as you can imagine, no small company, no small enterprise could afford these type of lawsuits. At the same time, there's been legal analysis made of the cases where tribunals have taken decisions in favor of the investors, and the result of this analysis is that in 94.5% of all the decisions, the companies that won had an annual revenue of at least $1 billion US. So we're talking about the largest of corporations that are benefiting from this system, and they use it as an extra insurance policy. They, in a way, the way we could see this system is a system that allows them to socialize any risks they might have when investing abroad. A system that, nobody else in society has, let alone people or small companies. So definitely a parallel system for the super rich.
And again, Cecilia, you've mentioned that this would be very costly and only the biggest of the corporations can afford such cases. But let's say if they win and then government have to pay a huge amount of money, do we know where would government find the money? Would it be a special pot of money somewhere, or would it be something that the normal citizen have to pay through taxes? Do we know anything about that, Pia?
Well, it's public money. It comes from the state budget. So obviously it is taxpayers, so citizens footing the bill in the end. And as Cecilia said, that bill can be very high. The awards go into the billions. The legal costs are also very high. It's also interesting to know that even if you do not lose as a state, you might still be ordered to pay your legal costs. That has happened many times, even in scandalous cases where the arbitrator said to the company, you're a bit crazy. You don't have a case here. Still, the government had to pay millions of dollars for lawyers. Yeah, and I think, in this time, this is particularly crazy. I mean, using public money for these kinds of lawsuits is always a problem, particularly for poorer countries. But in a pandemic, coming along with a huge economic crisis that will probably last for years, these costs become unbearable, particularly for countries that are not so rich. So yeah, it's also a huge financial problem in the end.
And I guess what makes it even more, sickening is that those sort of huge corporations that we're talking about often, in a way, hardly pay any taxes, right? So these they pay taxes, but, in regards to the money they make, it's very little. So these corporations, and in a way, are not giving anything back to society. I mean, they will tell you we create jobs and stuff, but we know that most of the time it's really poorly paid jobs and really demanding jobs. So they do not pay much taxes to society. And on top of that, as you said, right in the middle of a pandemic, they might sue governments for their response to it. It sounds, I was going to say Orwellian or something, but it's worse than that. I wanted to ask you, Cecilia, what could the line of defense be for governments if such cases actually materialize?
So if we're talking about cases in relation, to the measures taken in the context of COVID-19, states could defend their actions, claiming that the measures were necessary, taken in extreme circumstances. This is a particular category in investment law called force majeure. However, this line of defense that several governments have taken in the past has not proven to be sufficient to stop the lawsuits. For example, if we take the case of Argentina, that during their financial crisis in 2001, 2002, received a wave of investment lawsuits because of the measures that the government took as a result of the crisis. So in 14 of those cases, the government argued that these measures were taken out of necessity. Yet in 11 of those 14 cases, the tribunals rejected the argument. So I think the key word here is also defense. I mean, we shouldn't forget that this is a one-way system, and only investors can initiate the cases against the states. So the states can only defend themselves. And at the end of the day, it's the arbitrators, as Pia was saying, that will come up with interpretations that they see fit. They don't respond to anyone. They don't have to follow precedent. So yeah, the states can try to defend themselves in the best possible way and argue, that this was a need and all the rest of it. But it's up to the arbitrators to decide. And states at the most can aspire to not lose. They can never win.
Thanks. I wanted to end with something possibly optimistic, because in the report, you're also talking about a pushback and a fight back. What would be very scary if that, despite knowing what's happening, no one would do anything about it. And I know there's been op-eds, there's been petitions signed by hundreds of scholars, for example, talking for an end to the ISDS. So could you tell us, maybe Pia, you can start, and Cecilia, you finish, about the kind of pushback that it's happening in terms of states, activists, lawyers towards such unethical practices?
Well, it's an ongoing pushback, no? For many years already, I would say citizens groups, but also critical lawyers, academics, engaged policymakers, also some journalists, who have really dig deep into the issue, have made quite good progress in revealing what's happening, what's going on. We were not in that situation 15 years ago, let's say. But also in developing alternatives and in pushing governments to really get out of the treaties and not sign on to new ones, because that is what gives the power to corporations, and that is what you have to take back. And interestingly enough, 2019 was already the second year where around the world you had more treaties that were cancelled, that were terminated by governments, than newly signed. So you can really see a bit of a trend when it comes to termination of bad agreements with ISDS rights. But honestly, it remains an uphill battle, because as Cecilia said, governments defend different and represent different interests when they sign on to these treaties. And looking at my own country where I live, Germany, Germany has been hit very hard by ISDS with very expensive billion-dollar claims, and is still a staunch supporter of this regime. And I guess one reason is Germany's export industry. So the German government acts in favor of German companies going abroad, and then which obviously have more leverage. So it remains an uphill battle. And without sounding cynical, I do hope that the pandemic and the many things it puts into questions also helps us in questioning ISDS more, at least when we see actual claims being filed.
Cecilia, do you want to add anything?
No, I think, I shared what Pia said. I think what people also can do is, to at least demand at this moment that governments do a thorough review of, a cost-benefit analysis, an assessment of why are these treaties needed in the first place before signing new ones, and also in relation to the old ones. I mean, this is the absolute minimum that we need to demand today. And in this context of COVID crisis, there's also a growing momentum to ask governments to put in place a moratorium on these type of ISDS cases on COVID-related measures, and they could do that, for example, by withdrawing consent to ISDS disputes. So there is, certain very concrete demands that are growing among different groups of people, and that need further support. As you said, as long as people don't know that this exists and don't get outraged about it, we're fighting an uphill battle.
Many thanks, Cecilia, and thanks, obviously, PIA as well. Thank you.
Thanks to you for your
Frank.
interest in the story.
Thanks.